All right, well, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I have slides that more or less relate to what I'm talking about, but they're mostly for visual, just so but I do think it's important when we're talking about transportation that we think about, again, historically, who is it built for? Who was part of the planning? And what did it connect to? And what was the purpose? And when we first built in our area in Seattle, historically, in our first investments around transportation were really led by private companies that were owned by primarily developers and landowners of large tracts of land. And they built out what was our streetcar grid and system, mostly with the focus of development and being able to get people to their developments where they were building homes or to their jobs. And that the planners and the owners were rarely transportation experts or looking to really provide a service to the customers in per se. And it definitely was not necessarily initially planned or integrated, as there were dozens and dozens of private lines. But eventually, what we have today is really a system that's led by a handful of public entities and agencies with diverse leadership of multiple interests and stakeholders. And I think the other piece in terms of, as we're looking at what our transportation is serving, what's the vision, is that we're looking also at a mandate because of climate change and our growth management and our interests as a region to make sure that we take care of our earth and take care of the air, is that we have a mandate that for our transit to play a role in solving some of our most pressing issues around environment. So Puget Sound Sage, we do research and policy analysis and work with communities around how to make sure that we grow communities where everyone thrives. And in our research and our work, we have uncovered and made the case, along with others, that in order for us to meet the initial needs of our, the focus of our transportation, which is environmental and economic, for those desired outcomes to be achieved, it's undermined if we do not address equity. And our report, which is TOD, that's Healthy, Green, and Just, is now quite a couple years old. But in there, we review metro data that basically looks at a case study in Rainier Beach, which is the neighborhood I live in, and which is a neighborhood that does have a lot of multifamily units, but in terms of how we came to live there, is very much how a lot of people come to live in a places where we could afford, that also met our needs in terms of the communities that we wanted to live with and where we wanted to raise our kids and where our kids were already in school. And so, we lived at the very end of the 42. And it was, it's definitely the wrong, the track that is towards single family, right? And once we're there, we realize, that we're not being served well, and it's hard to make the transportation choices that we want to make as a family, except for our young son, who's 18 and super physical, and he can ride his bike, all the way up that steep hill. But what we saw is that in Rainier Beach is that we're one of the greenest neighborhoods. We have a large ridership of folks that do not own cars and use transportation and our public transit system to get them everywhere. And what's happening is that as that population is finding things less affordable in our city, they're moving into our suburbs and into the areas that look more like my neighborhood, where it's very hard for them to find the same kind of service to get to where they need to go. And so that as we move that population further out from our city and from our transit-rich areas, they're being forced into cars. And that the populations that have been, we're one of the fastest growing cities in our area, but the populations that we are attracting to our transit-rich areas are very much the folks that Executive Dow Constantine mentioned earlier. 90% of them own cars, and so they're moving into our cities with cars. And so it's with that in mind that we've partnered with One America and Transportation Choices Coalition and connected our communities to looking at how do we do our service right now in the county, and did a series of maps of just making the case that when we're looking at bus cuts or when we're looking at bus investments, that investments across the board, when it's straight up percentage, does not actually address equity and doesn't really get to our other goals around connecting people to where they need to go, to good jobs, and to address our issues around environment. And so our map showed a couple of things. We did a map around education and access to higher education, particularly to community colleges. And with our current service, we are showing that there's huge deserts of the exact population, which is our growth population, young immigrants, people of color, low-income folks. They were in those deserts. And so it was, again, in terms of how do we really give people choices to commute in ways that meet their values and their needs. And we also then showed maps around seniors and their access to health centers and to regional hospitals. And again, the populations that are most vulnerable or populations that are least served by our current service. So as we're looking at decisions, how are we factoring that in? And so in terms of a couple of disconnects and of how we're doing a long-range planning, I think is a disconnect for us is Sound Transit not building with the priority of leveraging our current investments and making the highest value of its investments to be towards equitable development and multimodal and to safety for the riders. And there's opportunity to address that in looking at how do we plan out the future of our light rail. And there's been a lot of work around the growing transit communities, which is a 3-year planning process of how do we make sure that every future development, including an opportunity to do an infill station in the Rainier Valley. I think there's also one opportunity in the north, but as an opportunity of how do we build an equitable development and really leverage this $1 million investment that we're making in making sure that that it's a transit-rich opportunity for affordable folks, or for folks that need that affordable housing. And so I think the other opportunity in terms of looking at long-range planning is how are we building on growing transit communities, on the neighborhood plans, on the comp plans, to make sure that they're actually all leveraging each other and adding information. Because as community folks, as many of you here in the room that I see, our activists, our volunteers are contributing, but there's only so many times that we can be engaged and so many meetings that we can go to. And so making sure that we're hearing back from how our transit agencies and our planning agencies are actually taking our information and incorporating it and bringing that back to us.
Thank you, Rebecca, very much.